Mr. Speaker, it is now many hours on from this legislation being introduced under urgency late last night. And I got to say, I still am kind of left quite puzzled in absence of any meaningful evidence as to the purpose of this very legislation. Mr. Speaker, I think it's just worthwhile putting on the record once again for the nth time the three reasons as to why the Green Party opposed this legislation. The first is that, as was put forward by the Reserve Bank Governor, Ardern Ardern, Finance and Expenditure Committee, most explicitly in the November 2022 hearing, which the now Minister of Finance was present at, in response to my question of whether that dual mandate had made any difference to decisions that they would have made had they only had that sole mandate of the focus on price stability, he said, and I quote, "No is the answer. We haven't come across any trade-offs of employment versus inflation. There is no conflict," end quote. And I totally take on board the point from the Minister that there could potentially be a point of conflict, but therein lies our second point, that it is unnecessary for this change to come about in law. And in fact, the major rationale that's been relied upon in this debate from the government side of things has been that letter that the Minister received speaking to the need to explicitly prioritise that dual mandate, particularly resulting in the primacy, the explicit primacy of that price stability mandate. And to that effect, as was put in that June 2023 review from the Monetary Policy Committee, there is a way to do that without changing the legislation. This was actually what the Minister's own officials recommended with regard to the ability to simply change the remit. And again, that's reflected in the regulatory impact statement out there for everybody to see. Thirdly, I have heard throughout this debate that the Minister still wants the Monetary Policy Committee to have regards to employment. We're yet to see how that will manifest through the MPC remit, and I'm very interested to see that. But it is, I think, a little bit concerning that we're basically being asked to wait and see here as to how that will manifest while this bill passes under urgency, and we're left without the evidence to have a meaningful and informed debate on what that remit is ultimately going to shape up to be. So, to reflect on some of the broader points that have been raised throughout this debate, because many have raised the notion of inflation in general and the notion of the economy, I just was reflecting on a meme, actually, that a friend of mine sent to me a few months ago throughout the election period, saying that whenever we're hearing politicians speaking about the economy, you can replace that word, the economy, with vibes. And we've kind of heard that in some sense from the sentiments as expressed from the Minister of Finance, that what is actually perhaps most important here is perception of market players, the vibes of market players, the confidence of market players. And again, to that effect, what we're really talking about here is that this economy that all of us so frequently talk about as a stagnant kind of set of rules that are somehow set in stone or concrete is in fact a set of rules created by human beings to govern all of us, our behaviour and activities, to get the kinds of outcomes that we all supposedly want in the society. Because, Mr. Speaker, we don't live in a game of monopoly, which, by the way, was invented in the early 1900s to actually teach children of the pitfalls of an economy that is premised on land speculation and luck. Yet, hey presto, what do we have to this day? I'd just like to quote here from Paul Hawken, who says, and I quote, "We have an economy where we steal the future, sell it in the present, and call it GDP." GDP, of course, invented by a guy called Simon Kuznets, who took it to the US Congress in the 1930s and was like, hey guys, here's a really good way for us to measure economic transactions at a macro scale inside of our economy. But God forbid, do not use it as a measure of what he called welfare and we now call well-being. That's because that baseline measure of just those transactions does not give us any meaningful insight into the value of those transactions, whether we actually want them in the first place, whether they actually benefit people and the planet, nor the distribution of those transactions, that is, who benefits from those transactions. Because, Mr. Speaker, the squiggly line of GDP can go up, but we also know full well that so too can homelessness, so too can the desecration of the environmental fundamentals that are necessary for life as we know it. So, Mr. Speaker, the kind of premise from the Green Party here is that we can do this economy thing a lot better. Mr. Speaker, we've heard a lot about how this bill is apparently going to be the magic bullet to deal with inflation. And in fact, we've heard some really fascinating things, including in the closing remarks from the Minister of Finance, about how we want to get rid of inflation. The kind of logical consequence of that is probably deflation or stagflation. And again, I'd really like some clarity, and perhaps we'll get that in this, magical monetary policy remit, which will come out at some point subsequent to this bill passing under urgency without any meaningful scrutiny. It's least of all through Select Committee. But all of this talk from members of the government about prices going up for many goods which are provided inside of our domestic economy largely under duopolistic kind of behaviour. It seems as though they're actually probably more fundamentally concerned about capitalism and the way that capitalism works. Because, Mr. Speaker, I can see they're rolling them up, and I'm grateful for it because I'd love them to stand up and to excuse or to make rationale for those points that they're talking about with regard to inflation and what drives it. Because, in fact, we actually also, throughout the election, had some great pieces of research coming out from the likes of the CTU, which showed us that corporate greed was one of the major drivers of inflation domestically. And they may bicker with me about that point, but so far, the major citation that I have heard from members of the government about the market players that matter right now with regard to their perception of inflation are Business New Zealand. And again, we can have all kinds of debates about the relationships that political parties have with entities outside of this House. But, Mr. Speaker, the fundamental point remains that this bill will not do what it says on the tin and what the government is promising that it will do. Because, again, those three core points that the Greens have stated time and again throughout this debate remain. It is that the Reserve Bank Governor himself has put it on the record, as the Minister well knows, that the dual mandate has not changed the way that they approach or focus on inflation or price stability. So the subtext of what's being put forward today by the government is that they don't trust the governor as far as that goes. The second thing is that it is unnecessary to change the law to do this, as reflected in the regulatory impact statement from the minister's own officials. They could do this through the remit, which it appears that they're also still planning to impose some kind of consideration for employment within. So again, I'm still kind of quite puzzled as to what outcome we're seeking to get here, because they still want the MPC to have regard to employment, if not maximum sustainable employment. And thirdly, they still want the Monetary Policy Committee to have regard to employment, i.e., they still want some kind of form of this dual mandate. We're just not quite sure how that's going to play out, and we're playing a wait-and-see game, which is not a very evidence-informed way to have a debate or discussion or to progress legislation. In fact, it's the opposite of evidence-based. So, Mr. Speaker, just and finally reflecting on all of the other pieces of evidence that have come out, and actually also some of the sentiments as expressed by the Minister about the kind of interrelationship between monetary policy and fiscal policy, because she was making it abundantly clear that her view, the economic orthodoxy's view, of which she and the government is apparently the arbiter of, that their view is that the sole remit of monetary policy should be that focus on price stability, and that it is the remit of fiscal policy, i.e. the things that the government does, tax and spend primarily, which should be that which focuses on employment. But I would also argue that that's where the government should also focus on things like productivity, and should also focus on things like inequality, should also focus on things like house price stability and otherwise rental affordability. And to that effect, it would be remiss of me not to mention a landmark piece of research which came out at the beginning of this year from Treasury with subsidiary papers from the IRD, which gave us a pretty clear insight into where the productivity problem is in this country. And, Mr. Speaker, it's in our tax system. It's in our tax system, which sees right now the top 311 families in this country holding more wealth than the bottom 2.5 million New Zealanders combined. Mr. Speaker, that is not an accident. It is a consequence of a tax system which sees a disproportionate burden placed on those who work for their living versus those who simply accumulate more and more capital. Mr. Speaker, that can be addressed. That can be addressed whilst also addressing our productivity problem and, God forbid, rewarding hard-working New Zealanders for their work. If we were to fix the problem which sees us as the only OECD country without any form of capital gains tax, of inheritance tax, of stamp duty tax, of ghost house tax, or otherwise. You can reduce the burden on working people if you fix our tax system, and you can get more productivity out of it in the long run. Mr. Speaker, we face massive challenges as a country and as a world with the dual crises of the climate crisis and inequality. This bill doesn't touch the sides on either of those things.
Call the Honourable David Seymour.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I thought it was another refreshing nugget of honesty in another of Chloe Swarbrick's speeches, where she said at one point, as somebody who spent 6.5 hours in this chamber debating this bill, she said there'd be no meaningful scrutiny. I mean, I think she needs to give herself a bit more credit. I know there's a productivity problem in New Zealand, but to spend 6.5 hours and then tell the whole world and put in Hansard on the public record that you achieved nothing is really taking self-effacement far too far. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to stand on behalf of ACT and as part of this government to support this bill. This bill is the right thing to do, and the opposition knows it. And we know they know it, and everyone at home can see they know it, because they have made such contradictory arguments. We heard from Deborah Russell at one point that if this bill went through and there was no longer an objective of maximum sustainable employment, then we would be neglecting people's jobs, that people could lose their jobs. And I guess the logical response to that is that the Reserve Bank should print as much money as possible to keep people employed. And that was an extraordinary thing for Deborah Russell to say, and to think that she was the Minister of Revenue responsible for the country's entire tax system, it just makes me glad that we're over that period, frankly. But then we also heard from Grant Robertson, who, I've got to give credit, has a few more chops, at least when it comes to the economy and spending money. He was making the argument, as was Chloe Swarbrick, that having a dual mandate for the past 3 years has actually made no difference whatsoever, so we might as well keep the dual mandate. We might as well keep the Reserve Bank focused on price stability and employment, because it only focuses on price stability anyway. Now, if anyone trying to follow along thinks, well, that doesn't quite make sense, well, they're actually right to think that, because it doesn't. Because if having a dual mandate, as we've heard claimed from the opposition, made not a jot of difference to how the Reserve Bank acted, the Reserve Bank effectively behaved as though the dual mandate was never introduced, then you might ask, what was the previous government and specific members still on that side of the House who voted for it, what was their justification for introducing the dual mandate? And there's a few possibilities, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps they thought wrongly at the time that the dual mandate would have an effect on monetary policy. And that's okay. We've all thought things in the past that turned out not to be true. In fact, that's actually how knowledge advances. You have a theory, you test it, sometimes it's wrong, you discard it and pick up a new theory. That's fine. But if it's true that they used to think the dual mandate would change the Reserve Bank's behaviour somehow for the better, and they've since learnt that it didn't, if they were rational people on the opposition benches, they would have changed their position and said, look, we were wrong then, it didn't make any difference, so we're quite comfortable with getting rid of it. That would have been a logical and sensible approach for the opposition members to take. But they haven't taken that approach. They've said, we introduced it, it made no difference, but somehow it should be kept. And how they managed to square that circle, I do not know. Another variant of that argument was made by Chloe Swarbrick, who had read in the regulatory impact statement that there was the possibility the government could achieve its objectives by changing the remit, that is the direction or the letter from the Minister of Finance to the Reserve Bank Governor, rather than changing the Reserve Bank Act. But once again, if that is true, that the objectives of the bank set out in the Reserve Bank Act make no difference and can be somehow substituted for or even overridden by the remit, then that would have applied just as logically back when the previous government changed the Reserve Bank Act to introduce the dual mandate. So if they really believe the argument they're making today, they could have actually just changed the remit 3 or 4 years ago instead of spending all of the time that they spent amending the Reserve Bank Act. And that leaves the opposition in quite a pickle. Were they right then? Are they right now? Is it possible they're wrong both times? Logically it's not, but I'm going to tell you which time they were wrong. You see, Mr. Speaker, it is a simple fact that if you hold one lever, you can only pull it in one direction at a time. And if the Reserve Bank holds a lever, which is how quickly the printing presses run or not, I know some people say, well, that's a metaphor, and they're right. How easily available do they make credit in the New Zealand economy? Well, they can either run the printing presses faster or slower. And if they run it faster, then at least in the short term, that can stimulate economic activity. No question about that. Countries all around the world, despots, bad rulers, they run the printing press fast, everyone feels rich for a while, and whoa, the economy takes off. But if there's not enough production, the prices go up, we get inflation, people find that they're actually just running to stand still, and it's hard to predict what stuff's going to cost. So you can certainly run it faster, and that can have an effect at least in the short run. Or you can run it slower, and sometimes that's necessary to make sure that there's not so much cash floating around in the economy and prices are more stable. What the government was asking the Reserve Bank to do with the previous policy of a dual mandate was push one lever in two directions at once. Well, Mr. Speaker, it cannot work. And we saw it come out in the debate where some members opposite said, well, maybe there could be two objectives, but we could just make it really clear that one was more important than the other. But the question that immediately arises, Mr. Speaker, is how much more important? Does it mean that just sometimes they should push the lever in one direction, but most of the time the other, according to whether it's employment or inflation that is most important to control? How would they prioritise that one was more important than the other? The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that the Reserve Bank has one lever, print money faster or print money slower, and they can only push the lever in one direction at a time. If they try to do both, or even if they try to pretend some subterfuge that they're prioritising one over the other, then they will find that they cannot be honest and they cannot be accountable because it's logically impossible to answer the question of whether they're doing the right thing. The only available answer will always be we're doing both because we have to. And so moving back to a single mandate is the only way that we can be sure that we will have a Reserve Bank that clearly understands its job, that is totally accountable for doing its job, that can never say, well, I failed at one but I was doing both. There will be one standard for the Reserve Bank, and that is, have they met their single objective, which is price stability. And for members opposite who say, when will this work and how can it work and did it work before? Well, economies and market participants are funny things. You see, Mr. Speaker, markets are really about processing information. And when new information comes into play, people start to take account for it. People start to price in what they expect to happen in the future. And, Mr. Speaker, I suspect that other things being equal, by taking this step today, by sending the message we now have a government that is prepared to put its time and its capital, and a whole lot of Chloe Swarbrick's time apparently, into making sure it's perfectly clear what our monetary policy objectives are, that people are going to start pricing in that a new sheriff is in town and inflation is going to the wall. And I just suspect that actually that is going to have an effect on the prices that people pay, and they will be lower than they would have otherwise been, and people can start to feel some relief from the long, hard, grinding road of inflation they've been subject to by the previous government for nearly 3 years now, where inflation has been outside the target band. That's why the leadership being shown by this government to everybody in the New Zealand economy, that price stability and sound money are front and centre, is an essential foundation to the economic recovery and the prosperity that this country sorely needs. I support this bill and commend it to the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.